minutes for the talk at the start, but I'll probably try and stick to the 15. So hello. So I'm Duncan from UCL CASA, so the Centre for Advanced Spatial Analysis, and this paper was done with a couple of colleagues, Sean McLaughlin at Maynooth and Martin Brinskow at Aarhus, and what I'm going to be talking about is a project called Organicity, which was running from 2015 through to last year. And this was a project that we were doing, looking at trying to create an experimentation as a service facility. So I've spent the past 10, 15 years trying to look at how digital technologies like sensor networks, IoT, can be used within an urban context. But what this project was really about was trying to, how can we get those tools being used by citizens? So the project goals are there. There was a variety of different partners on the project. And essentially what we were trying to create is we built out this, if like a technical platform, which is this thing in pink, that was then interfacing through to 3 different kind of core cities who were involved in the project, Aarhus, London, and Santander. But then this experimentation as a service API. What I'm going to talk through is the lessons that we learned through actually trying to implement this and use it with about 43 different entities over the course of a few years. In parallel to that, I'm also a member of the Smart London Board, which is a group of people from industry and academia who are basically helping to inform City Hall in London around how technology could be used. I think one of the interesting kind of observations or trends that I would say that's occurred over the past sort of 5 years of activity with them is this quote over here is the Smart London Board's remit back in 2013. And you can see it's very much kind of smart city in the context of trying to drive efficiency and operation. And it was very much kind of looking at it from that sort of technical perspective. What's been really nice is that this is now how that's so the board has evolved over the past 5 years, and this is now the new mandate for it. And you can just see that even in that language, there's a slightly more softer focus around actually we're trying to create an environment where actually the citizens are a key part of this technical infrastructure. So that's also kind of another vector that's kind of that has been significantly informing this work. There's a little medium link down here to the Smart London Board post. There's some interesting sort of background stories as to what they're doing there. It's worth having a look. I'm not going to touch on that any further today. Okay, so what was the motivation behind the experimentation as a service platform? I guess there's 3 kind of key questions that we were trying to answer. So one was around this kind of ideas, we obviously believed that it was going to be a valuable thing to do, but we wanted to sort of try and test that idea. We were also trying to figure out how can you sustain citizen engagement over a longer term. So there's lots of examples of where people had started to do things, but then they kind of petered or fizzled out. And the third one was kind of what are the challenges to which this service is responding. So how do you embed this into, in our case in London, into City Hall in London? How do you get them to actually engage with this? The things that we created, so there's a whole bunch of technical tools that were developed from IoT platforms through to crowd sensing applications. So that's kind of symbolized here by all these tools. We also had this idea of this urban data exploratory. So there was a data portal into all this information that was both being captured by experimenters, but also data sets that existed that cities that were involved wanted to be sharing. But then also there was this platform where we were trying to automatically extract other information out of those combination of those sources. So as an example of that, there was algorithms running in the background to try and look at, for example, the reliability of data. So if there is a data point that is being captured over time that no one ever accesses, is that as useful as a data point that is being used by 100 different organizations? How would we start to sort of trust these data streams in different ways? Is there a way that you can start to add in that layer of information into these data sets? Because if you go and look into lots of these data stores at the moment, it's just buckets of data. And the context around how accurate they are, how often they're updated, who maintains them, how many people are using them, all that context doesn't exist. So that was kind of a third kind of part that we were trying to look at. give you time to absorb this diagram. So, I haven't done a slide like this for a long time. There's 4 key points that I want to show you on this map, but this is basically the journey that we went through on the project. And I'm going to come over this side. So we started off, there's basically 2 peaks. There's the first open call here, the peak of expectation, and there's a second open call here, second peak of expectation. And what we basically did, we set up this kind of technical platform, but then a lot of the time was also spent actually then working with the different communities that we were working with to try and get to a point where we got to the open call and then facilitated people or helped people to basically be applying for funding, which they would then go through and do these kind of 2 phases of experimentation that are denoted here, where they would basically be going and trying to deploy the things that they were, either the tools that we were using or tools that they were developing themselves. And I guess one of the key things that I'm trying to kind of show here is that half of the work was technical in nature, in terms of developing the platforms, but there was an equal amount of other activities happening through the process where we were trying to both sort of raise relevant challenges or calls with the cities, but also trying to put out calls for like challenges or problems for people to be responding to, but then facilitating that process. And then in terms of during this process, there's 2 key points, which are basically these 2 groups of experimenters. So here I think we had about, it probably says on here, there was about 17, I think, experimenters. And then at this later stage, we had about 34 experimenters compared to the 254 applications that we received. So there's quite a broad group of people. On the earlier slide, it showed that there was 1.8 million of the funding of the project was allocated to the experimenters. So that was kind of the size or scale of the activity that was going on. During both of these phases of experimentation, we were basically interviewing, watching the experimenters and learning from how they engage with the process. So, for example, at this phase here, in this first round, we learned a huge amount about how all of the problems that we had in this first open call, a huge amount about some of the sort of technical challenges of delivering the platform for people to be using, and people's expectations as to what was going to be available. All of those were in. So the key part, what I want to talk through is that there's a whole bunch of lessons that we learnt through that process of talking to those experimenters. And they kind of have informed this kind of what we're calling the 4 service pillars. So these are kind of the 4 key things that we were delivering, that we were then asking the experimenters about to try and understand if this experimentation as a service notion would actually work. So I'm going to go through I'll go through these 4 quickly. So with this first one, the systematic experimentation. So I mentioned that we developed a technical platform. So half of the project team were geeks developing technology, and we used Fireware, products and services that were already existing from other EU projects, and we built a whole bunch of services around it. So we had this kind of classic large EU framework project, technical architecture of a massively complex system that was doing lots of different things. All driven by this kind of core Organicity platform, which was like a data broker of some sort. But then we had all of these. It had this federation API at the bottom, which allowed all the different cities to be able to build their own components that they were fitting into that. And then this experimentation as a service API, which was kind of what the experimenters saw kind of from the outside in terms of services that they could use. This is a screenshot from a GitHub repository, which is where all this documentation is. There's a whole bunch of work that was done in terms of trying to get experimenters to be able to onboard them with different tools and services. So again, one of the things that we kind of learned was that the teams that were working up, that were doing the experiments had a massive variety of different technical expertise, to the point where some teams had no technical people in their teams. Okay, how do you get non-technical people using a platform such as this? You can't just point them to a GitHub repository and say, clone that, and then off you go. You have to kind of give them some support and structure around that. So we ended up kind of creating lots of sort of tools to help people to do that. Tools and tutorials. the second area was around the co-creation. So so as I mentioned, we spent I'd argue a good half of the project team ended up being people like this in this little diagram down here, which were people that were basically their role was to try and help experimenters understand how to use this technical behemoth that we'd created, because it turns out it's not that transparent to many people. So that was kind of one side of it, was just how to actually use the technical tools. But there's another side as well, which was kind of how to solve problems that actually cities wanted to engage with. And so there was also quite a bit of activity of actually just working with the cities to help them to define the challenges, to help them describe which data was actually available, and to then facilitate how that could be made available. And so to do that, we also created a whole bunch of different guides that people in different cities could be using to do this engagement. Now, when we started, it was the three cities, so London, Santander, and Aarhus, who were basically, so these guides were created for ourselves in the first experiments. In the second phase of experiments, we had about 4 other cities all joined us. So some of those we funded, some of them just joined because they wanted to participate. So they were also guides to help them to be able to, again, onboard people onto using this system. Then I'll do the third and fourth ones together. So the federated ethics and privacy. So note, this was done just before GDPR came into effect within Europe. So we were trying to, but we were kind of cognizant that would be coming towards the end of the project. And this one is around the management of liability and IP. And in both of these, what was really interesting is we had a lawyer on the project, and we spent quite a lot of time trying to figure out how to do this for the project in a way that could be used across all the parties. And at the start, it was being done very kind of, not piecemeal, but it was being done very kind of individually. And we realized it wasn't going to scale in that sense. You can't treat each project as an individual project, even though they are individual projects. So what kind of frameworks can you put in place to make it much easier? And by this, I mean, so that the project funding that was being allocated to the experimenters wasn't purely consumed in just dealing with the paperwork to cover the IP stuff. Yes, how can you get this going sort of, at little or no expense? And what was interesting there was that actually quite a bit of this, it ended up being very similar across the different organizations, even though people felt it would be quite different at the outset. So again, what this turned into was things like checklists and guides and simple contracts with human readable text in them that the experimenters were having to sign up to agree with the experimental terms. They didn't have to go and get legal advice to know whether they should sign these documents or not. Okay, so last 2 slides. So in terms of the observation, so I mentioned that we observed the experimenters and we interviewed them, and we did get feedback from them in terms of things that were working and things that weren't. And these are the first 6 are kind of key observations from the experimenters. So the value proposition that pretty much most of them described was this enabling and supporting role. So the enabling one is probably the bigger one, I think, than the supporting one. But the actual Organicity sort of project, experimentation as a service model, allowed them to be able to do things typically with city departments that they were finding difficult to get access to in the past. The funding one came up as a reasonably obvious one. Guess what? Most of the experimenters cited that the reason why they applied to become experimenters was to get the funding to do some work. That's the reality of lots of these businesses, lots of these small groups, community groups that are trying to do this activity. They need that kind of support. The time impact of living labs. So this was, again, several of the experimenters, well, let's say they didn't get as much done as maybe they thought that they might do when it came down to the reality of deploying their IoT idea, whatever that might have been, in the context of civic infrastructure. It was just that it always takes a bit longer. If you think about what an experimentation as a service should be, it's about learning some of those lessons when you can fail quickly and early. So that was so to us, that was a kind of a positive thing that we started to see out of the experiments. And again, that ties into the in situ perspective. The feedback that we got was that it was really valuable to do because we suddenly realized the problems of access, power, and connectivity. we couldn't just cut a hole in the side of the bus to put an air quality monitor in. And we were surprised that the bus company were finding that difficult for us to do. It's kind of well, why would you find that surprising? It's kind of, these are challenging things to do. And there's no power to be able to power our sensors. Can't we just plug it into a lamp column? Well, actually, no, there's a whole process you have to go through to be able to get permission to do that kind of thing. And then the benefits, so on this kind of co-creation side, was that there was a significant amount of kind of workshops and activities done with people. And it might have felt kind of overkill for people at the start. There's a bit of kind of why we're having more workshops. We know what we want to do, but actually the outcome of those, when they were talking with people about the problems that the cities were facing, they often then changed or pivoted their idea a little bit. And so actually having that kind of sight into other people and having that early access actually was declared to be a value. And the last one, the future value in the multi-city context. Again, there's a couple of experimenters. We only had a handful of experimenters that actually truly did do cross-city experimentation. Most of them were based in one city. But all of those that did do multi-city ones, they cited the benefit of being able to have access to trying to apply it in different, apply their idea in the different contexts. And then beyond the experimenters, we also spoke to several different parties. But for example, on our part, we spoke to the GLA in London, and to get their feedback on how well this fitted with their current plans. And there's three things they kind of highlighted. One was the exploiting the data stores. So London has got a fantastic open data store. About the time that we were doing this, they were starting to hit that problem of, we've got this massive, fantastic open data, but not as many people are using it as we thought they might. So actually, how can we start to get people exploiting this data that we've got available? The second one was around kind of engaging innovation in urban data. It relates to that previous comment, but that kind of struck a call for ideas or programs around trying to use this information, gave them another vehicle for being able to actually try and get people to be using these assets that the city has, but kind of would like to engage the citizen more with. And then the last one, the framework for challenge-based experimentation. Again, it was this. It became a simpler way for people to have permission to go and try things in a very lightweight way. It was just an experiment, but having the framework around which to do that was another cited benefit. Okay, so just to finish off, so in summary, three key lessons learned. One was that the technical framework that we had, the platform, it needs maintenance. It didn't just run magically by itself. So again, having the resources to allow people to actually support these things was a real thing that cities would have to enable. The experimentation service requires financial and human capital. So if you remember that team that I had down here of people, again, cities had to recognize that actually there was that facilitation process was a required process, and there's a human cost to that, as in staffing. And the governance is different but similar. So the next stage of this, the project finished in 2018, but it's carrying on under two other guises at the moment. One is a Horizon 2020 project called Synchronicity, which has got very similar notions, and some similar partners are on that project. But also the Open and Agile Smart Cities initiative, lots of the activities being picked up in there now. So if you're not aware of that, that's worth having a look. From a personal perspective, we're moving within UCL CASA over to UCL East in 2022, where the Olympic Park, which was one of the test sites of the Organicity project, continues to be a living lab that we're developing. So there's elements of this EaaS, experimentation as a service model, that we're still going to be continuing to apply within this Future Living Institute, the work that we're doing in UCL East. Thank you very much.